Hello and welcome to the Small Business Briefing. I'm Brian Calley, CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan.
Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Sarah Miller, Vice President of Marketing and Strategic Communications at SBAM. And as we'd like to do on our Monday show, we want to welcome one of our newest members. This member is called the Corned Beef Queen, and her name is Ruby Alexander. We actually met her last week at an owner-to-owner event in Royal Oak. So welcome, Ruby and your team, to the SBAM member family. And of course, we're welcoming her on behalf of our sponsor, Consumers Credit Union. We heard from them last week too. You can learn more at consumerscu.org. So, Brian, last week on Thursday, we did have an update on the UAW strike as it related to a deal with Ford. And now the strike does seem to be wrapping up. So why don't you fill us in on the latest?
Yeah, so maybe this will be our last update. We'll see, unless something doesn't come together. It's been big news and more than 6 weeks of simultaneous strikes between General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis. And so since Thursday, when Ford struck a tentative deal, there was then a tentative deal with Stellantis, and then the UAW expanded their strike on General Motors to include a plant, actually the biggest production plant in Tennessee, and then as of today, a tentative agreement reached with General Motors. And the contract's word is that the agreed amount, the negotiated amount that would go into the new contracts is pretty similar between the companies. 25% wage increases spread over the life of the contracts, which is 4 years, and but front end loaded. So the compounding increase would be more like 26% over the life of the contract, but that's how much the wage scale is moving up. But keep in mind that that does not include cost of living, automatic cost of living, or inflationary increases on top of that. So that's the wage part of it. The part that I think was kind of sticky in the end to try to figure out, and it'll be interesting to see the details of it, is what happens with the joint ventures with respect to like these battery plants that so far the model has not been the auto companies just to do it, to go solo and do it on their own. They're doing them as joint ventures. So these aren't just employees of General Motors, Ford, or Stellantis, but they tend to be joint ventures. Do the union contracts apply to those as well? And they agreed to, quote, a pathway to unionization for those battery plants. Exactly what that means is not clear to me at this moment, but I think the union was pretty happy with the idea that they wouldn't kind of automatically be cut out of those plants. And the only other item that was kind of interesting that came out of it was in Illinois, there was a plant that Stellantis had idled, and they committed as part of this project to, or part of this negotiation to assign a new product to be produced at that plant. Now, you might recall many weeks ago that Ford and Unifor, who is the union, the main automaker union in Canada, they came to an agreement and ratified it with Ford, but they're now striking with Stellantis in Canada. So, but for the U.S. automakers, the 150,000 plus auto workers have been called back essentially, or they're sent back into work. However, getting plants ramped up is much more difficult than closing them down. So the idea of ramping up production, these plants can produce more than a car, many of them like more than a car per minute, and so they won't be operating anywhere near at that level until for quite some time. Because keep in mind, it's not just the auto companies, but it's all of their suppliers. There's a lot of things that happen in the supply chain in order for that final assembly to happen. And so the logistical symphony that needs to come together for a vehicle to be built is very, very substantial. And so I expect that it'll probably be a number of months before they're really back up to what you consider to be full production.
All right, and as you kind of reflect on the whole situation here, I mean, there's always a winner and a loser. So who are the winners? Who are the losers in this whole situation?
It is tempting to say that at least in the short term, that the UAW and the new leader of the UAW, Shawn Fain, are the main winners here, and I think it's fair to characterize it that way. Kind of going in, even though their original request was topped out at 46% wage increases, they did get automatic cost of living adjustments, and um, a pretty substantial increase. But I'd also say that you have to keep in mind that the rest of the world has not been standing still. So all employers are giving raises these days, and or most employers are, in order to hold on to employees. And so, like, the idea of General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis committed to larger increases in the past, I would say that should be considered in the context of what employers have done over the last 3 years since those contracts were in place at the automakers that just expired. So it's not, we can't look at it in a vacuum and assume that the whole world stayed the same, and now here General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis are doing these big increases. There's a lot of, we look at the data month by month. But I still do think that the UAW is a pretty big winner in this, and that it probably will aid in their organizing efforts in the future. And if it does create a pathway for them to get in on more of the electrification, the more electric vehicles in the future, the battery plants, then that's another win. Now, the auto companies, I was looking at some information about losses that they sustained because of the strike. Now, the striking automakers lost wages as well, but General Motors said that the strike cost them $200 million in the third quarter, and it expects to take an $800 million hit in lost production revenue in the fourth quarter. So, they've got hard costs, but then also opportunity costs or missed sales. And then Ford said it was a $100 million loss in the third quarter, and total cost, though, of $1.3 billion from the strike, which of course include a slowdown in production, which will persist even though they're called back now for a while. No numbers on Stellantis that were shared. The other loser that I would put in the analysis would be advocates for electrification of vehicles. These are significantly higher costs for the automakers, and they are going to have to focus more on their most profitable vehicles, and those are combustible engine vehicles. So they really can't afford to move at the pace toward electrification when they take a loss in the electrification. And the auto executives have been telegraphing now to the feds, who really have been pushing hard for the fleet to move, the U.S. fleet, everybody's vehicles, to move toward electric, that consumers just aren't going along with this, even with the massive amount of subsidies that the federal government is putting into incentivizing consumers. It's still just not happening at the level that they expected. And so I think this is really going to change the dynamics for how quickly they move toward the ramp up of in the development, frankly, of electric vehicles, when they cannot afford to take a loss. I mean, if you look at the whole analysis, like, the worst thing that could happen, say, for Ford, for example, who's making a good amount of money on the combustible engine vehicles, and at least those that, even if they're hybrids, but have combustible engine vehicles, and then losing on every electric vehicle. what if everything did move to electric vehicles? They'd be in deep, deep trouble right now. So they really can't afford to have that happen because they would lose money. When the UAW was leveraging the just the situation and the realities of the labor market, and then pointing to Ford's profits, for example, Ford's profits, but General Motors, Stellantis too. It was really the profits that were based on the combustible engine vehicles, and so that's the thing, is like the contract requires that production to stay in place, or else the companies just wouldn't be able to make it. So I think advocates for moving toward a more electric fleet are, I would say, potentially losers in this transition, because until something changes with the either consumer demand and their willingness to pay for electric vehicles, or some sort of a change in the production cost overall of electric vehicles, it's hard to see it moving at the type of pace as what the feds in particular wanted to see it move in the past.
Okay, Brian, we have 3 issues that we've been watching really closely here in Michigan in the legislature. And let's take these one by one. First up, the Michigan Senate has sent a bill package to the House related to energy. SBAM opposes these bills. So could you walk us through what the issues are at hand and kind of what the next steps are going to be?
Yeah, so we've been following these for a while, and we talked about them on this briefing a few times. What has changed, though, is that Senate Energy Committee, after really struggling with the bills for quite some time, moved them out of the Senate, or out of the committee, and then out of the Senate on a party line vote on Thursday. So they went from the Senate over to the House. The House, I think, is going to want to try to pass them. There's really 4 pieces to it, but 3 that came over from the Senate, and then a 4th that is led by the House. So let's talk about the one that's led by the House first, because it's pretty controversial, but it's citing of solar and wind projects. Right now, local zoning determines approvals for those sorts of things. The House is proposing to change that approval over to the Public Service Commission. So this is a gubernatorial appointed board of 3 that would decide for the whole state if somebody got an approval for wind and solar projects. So in other words, it's an override of local zoning. So that's those who want to see the move toward electrification of the infrastructure grid more quickly than it's already happened, and it's happening quickly, by the way. But those who want to see it go even more quickly are saying, look, it's hard to cite these things. There's local government approvals you got to go through, and it would be a lot easier if you didn't have to mess with that, and therefore you could just go through this 3-member political appointee board and just get approvals there for the state wherever they say you can. That's very, very controversial. Overriding local control is always very controversial, so that will not be an easy one for them to get passed through the process, but we'll see how it goes. So that's one piece of it. Now there are there's a renewable energy mandate, and that they made 2 changes in the Senate where they moved it, instead of 2035, they changed the date to 2040 to go to 100% renewable. And then they also changed the definition of renewable, so it allows nuclear. I'm going to put a big asterisk by the nuclear, because it's nuclear plants are so expensive. There very rarely does a new nuclear plant come online. Decades go by before you have a new one in the whole country. They're extremely hard to get permitted. So basically what this is saying is that the way I read it is that existing nuclear, which is a relatively small piece of the overall puzzle, but an important one in Michigan, can stay and as part of the overall package. And then with natural gas, what they say is natural gas with sequestration, where they have to run 90% efficient, and then to essentially capture the carbon. And I don't really know a lot about that technology and how difficult that is to happen. But the concern with this bill is that they set a date certain when all this has to happen. And remember that our interest in the natural gas infrastructure across the state, it comes in more than one area. It's not just that it's a reliable baseload, low emission baseload, but it's used for heating. So the idea of taking it out of the electricity portfolio could make it less viable and the home heating. In other words, the overall cost of getting natural gas everywhere it needs to be could be relatively higher for heating homes and businesses. So there's some concerns there, although they did make the bill better than it was. There are actually two bills that all this stuff is contained in. So that part was better, but still some concerns, still opposition. The main concern, though, is Senate Bill 502, which moves a lot of regulatory functions or adds regulatory controls at the Public Service Commission, a lot of environmental regulatory controls. And there's a litany of things in there that we don't necessarily need to detail here, but we already have an environmental regulatory department, and it's called EAGLE, the Environment and Great Lakes and Environment, Great Lakes and Energy Department. They already do regulations, and so it's like a double set of regulations. They also would require on solar and wind energy installation projects prevailing wage regulations, which means they would need to be union jobs in order to get in on the construction. And of course, that's problematic as well. So we still opposed the bills. They were just slightly less bad than they were when they originally passed or originally were introduced in the Senate. Now they're in the House. We do expect that there'll be an effort to get them passed out of the House here before they close up shop, which could be, as early as next week. So they might be done for the year. So that's the energy package. There's really a lot to it, and this will be one of our top priorities to get those bills either changed substantially or stopped.
All right, next up are efforts related to economic development. What's happening there?
You might recall in the beginning of the year, we talked a lot about economic development tools for bigger companies, and there were billions of dollars incentives that were put into a handful of projects that around the state through this strategic outreach and reserve fund, the SOAR fund. That got very, very, there was a lot of fatigue in the legislature for those types of projects. Like every time they turned around, the MEDC and the governor had another project. We need, $400 million for this one. We need to get this company $1 billion. You need to, there were all of these different payments, and what made it difficult was that the Republicans really weren't into that, so they weren't voting yes. And there were a lot of Democrats that were like, we're giving big businesses billions of dollars now. So it got really hard for them to kind of muscle through the appropriations to give to these companies for economic development. And so in the Senate, they took up a proposal to make some changes to make it more amenable, in this case, to the Democrats, so they would feel good about voting for economic development incentives, and then just added a bunch of strings, just kind of like social justice issues, community benefit packages. My impression, now this isn't really SBAM's issue per se. Small companies do not qualify for these big business incentives. My impression is that if these bills, as they're proposed right now, pass, then they probably won't get utilized because there aren't too many companies that would say, hey, I can meet all of these requirements, because it's like they're really asking these bigger companies, and they do these projects to solve for issues like childcare and housing and things that the government can't seem to really, get their arms around and solve. These companies aren't going to be able to do that either. And they also have issues that they put conditions that a lot of companies wouldn't be able to meet. So that you're not in good standing anywhere if there's any kind of environmental issue. Well, these really big companies that operate around the country and around the world, there's always something somewhere going on that, and any of those things could trip up one of these projects. So my impression is that if the economic development package passes, it'll make the program itself one that, like, on the books we have one, but it's kind of a moot point because it's hard to see very many companies saying, yeah, I'll take one of those incentives and live up to all of these requirements when it's a great big world and a great big country, and probably would be the case where there's a better deal somewhere else.
All right, and lastly, let's talk about the research and development bills that we previously discussed on the show. What's the status there?
So finally, something that we might actually support and be able to get behind. Seems like there's been a lot of defense this year. So on research and development, a tax credit for research and development has been bantered about for a while, and the House introduced some bills. They had them in committee and moved them out of committee into the floor, but they have shown some willingness to make some adjustments. The way that they were introduced originally and the passed out of committee, we didn't support because they set up like a fund, and you'd have to go get approval from a government board and meet all these conditions. It was the sort of thing where it was difficult for us to see many small businesses have either having the inclination or just the ability, the skill set, the time, access to the experts and folks to kind of go through this complicated government process to get access to one of these credits. And it was a predetermined amount, and you wouldn't know how much you got until they saw all the applications for the year. It just really, we didn't see it as being worth doing in the way it was introduced. So not something that we oppose, but also something that we did support because we just couldn't see it helping our members. What we asked them to consider was just an add-on to the federal research and development tax credit. So there's a federal credit that already exists. And it's industry agnostic, so it doesn't pick which industries are the favorite industries. Anybody who does these actions can get it. There has been some willingness, actually, a lot of discussion around making modifications. So we're cautiously optimistic that maybe once they get to their final form and final passage, that there'll be the sorts of things that will help any business in any industry that engages in research and development activity in our state. And so sit tight, maybe we'll have one that we support here.
All right, Brian, I think you have a Data Monday report for us next.
Yeah, so I want to share with you our Data Monday, which has GDP, a little bit of a surprising report that came out last week with our gross domestic product. And as you can see, it is at 3.5%. That was higher than what was expected year by year. And then looking at the nominal number, of course, even higher. So remember, the difference between GDP nominal and net is the first is adjusted for inflation. So before inflation, it was a pretty big number at 6.3%. Looking at it quarter by quarter, and this is kind of how it's the traditional way of looking at it. You'll notice, looking back in the first half of 2022, remember we had a couple quarters in a row where GDP was negative, and but then went back positive, and now we are 5 quarters in a row of positive GDP, and including the third quarter, which was, as you can see, looking on here, it's not like it was incredibly high or anything, but compared to what we would compared to where we were, was a little bit higher. Now it's always a grain of salt, or not a grain of salt, but what tempers this is that there's still concerns about inflation. Remember, we looked at the inflation numbers before, and they stopped going down, and maybe we're inching up a little bit. So the idea that we had GDP go up more than expected, it has me a little worried about the Federal Reserve's perceived risk of inflation in the future, or actual risk of inflation in the future, and what will that mean in terms of their desires to keep inflation under control? Are they going to look at increasing rates more? Now, what drove GDP in this last quarter? Well, if you look at this column over on the right, on this or I'm sorry, in the middle here, in the third quarter of 23, on the middle of the graph here, you'll see that consumer spending and government spending were big drivers. Exports were pretty healthy as well. So just looking at consumer and government spending, kind of both driving GDP. The U.S. personal consumption, as you can see, that looking at it just in a different way, quarter by quarter here on this bar graph, and so consumer spending, people are still spending. Just a few things on jobs or joblessness. So this was kind of interesting, that continuing jobless claims. So you see that that's the orange number. This is going up. What that means is that people who recently filed unemployment claims, that they're continuing on unemployment. So that the number of people that are employed this week that were also unemployed last week, and I guess would be a better way of putting it. So that number is going up. And then in terms of the initial jobless claims, that's actually going up a little bit too. So this is an interesting dynamic. While these two are not chained together, initial and ongoing jobless claims, one's going up quite a bit more than the other at the moment. And then looking at U.S. personal income, it's a that's what you see at the top. So you see pretty steady there, a little bit more moderate than it was, but still pretty healthy. Maybe wouldn't call it high though. And then the personal consumption expenditures, you see people are spending. So they're saying that go to that GDP driven by consumer spending. And then here's the last slide here that I wanted to share from the New York Times. I was a little bit surprised. I hadn't seen this broken out in this way, but looking at working mothers. So you got the labor force. We show it by women and men, but this would be labor force participation. This bottom line of women who have younger children at below 5 in labor force participation. And you can see since 2020 in the pandemic how much that has gone up. And there have been so many efforts and focus on expanding access and affordability of childcare, and there's a lot of work to do. But I've seen this happening all across the country, and it was interesting to see that apparently it's making some difference. That may be just one factor overall, but looking at the prime working age from 25 to 54, women with children, especially younger children, the labor force participation rate is actually up. Really, it's probably at an all-time high. This goes back just looking at, going back to about 1990. But for women with young children, it doesn't appear as though the labor force participation rate has ever been as high as it is right now.
All right, well, thanks for that report today, Brian. I do want to let everyone know that we have an owner-to-owner event here in Lansing on Wednesday. It's at 4 p.m. You can learn more and register on our website, sbam.org/events. And if you're in the area, we hope to see you there. Have a great week. We'll be back here on Thursday.
Yeah, you're not going to want to miss this owner to owner. It's at the top of the Boji Tower. It's a really cool site above the Capitol looking down. And just this weekend, they put up the Christmas tree in front of the Capitol. Doesn't have the lights on it yet, so it's not decorated, but it's always kind of an exciting time. And, I was looking out there earlier, we had some flurries blowing around, so it's beginning to look a lot like Christmas around here. Thanks for joining us, everybody. We'll see you on Thursday.